I was wrong. I I was a little off in some of my recent analysis about answers in Genesis, and we need to talk about that. My name is Joel Duff, and this is This Week in Creationism, episode number 78. We're taking a look at recent events in the world of Young-Earth Creationism, and we have one big one to talk about. And it has to do with that second item, which is related to the first item about me being wrong, in past episodes. There does seem to be some trouble in Ken Ham's theme park paradise. And we need to talk about one of the employees that's left at Answers in Genesis, which apparently is Nathaniel Jeanson. Nathaniel Jeanson has a video out today, and I want to respond to his 1% lament. So we have just those two items for This Week in Creationism coming up next. Yeah, so what do I mean that I was wrong? Well, let me just give a really brief summary of some things that I've been talking about over the past month, specifically with regards to Answers in Genesis. I made this video in which we went over some of the financials of Answers in Genesis and the other Young-Earth Creationist, major Young-Earth Creationist organizations. Answers in Genesis is the big bully on the street with respect to Young-Earth Creationism. And as such, we saw that they have the lion's share of the donation dollars from the Christian community. And they have their theme parks, right? The Ark Encounter and the Creation Museum. And they are bringing in, like a substantial amount of money, we saw. And we showed that they have hundreds of millions of dollars in assets. And they have, according to just 2 years ago, the most recent statement we have, they had an excess that year of nearly $20 million. So it seemed like at least 2 years ago, they were on reasonable financial footing, despite all the things that they're saying and doing, and they're growing and adding new attractions all the time. It seems like they're flush with money. And if you get a vibe from what I'm saying, my message here is going to be they're not actually flowing with money, which came a little bit as a surprise to me recently. And so that's the thing that we want to focus on. But there's some other issues as well that are percolating in Answers in Genesis. So to get me talking about those, remember, I've also been talking about the new creationists, sort of a branch, another flavor of Young-Earth Creationism, you might say, that is outside of sort of the reach of Answers in Genesis. And we talked about how I think, like I've been saying, that it is the future of Young-Earth Creationism if it is to have any success at all in terms of wooing the Christian community to maintain their faith and conviction in Young-Earth Creationism. And also, I've been talking about how Ken Ham has been very lonely lately. He has had to multiple times been very introspective about like where are the next generation of leaders, because he has seen multiple leaders fall away. All right, I don't mean fall away from their convictions. I mean fall away in the sense of they've died. All right, they're no longer with us. And Ken Ham has shown pictures of himself at a number of different luminary mega pastor funerals. And he has been bemoaning the fact that, where's the next generation of big names, all right? Big people with big followings that can sort of like draw in people. And so I've been pointing out that he's, getting a little long in the tooth and he needs to find a successor. And of course, we've talked about multiple times how they brought in Martin Iles and was crowned, all right, right, the future king of Answers in Genesis, the successor for Ken Ham. I guess technically that lasted almost 2 years, but it didn't feel like that. It felt like 6 months to a year at most in terms of time he was active, and actually seemed like he might be taking the reins of Answers in Genesis. Although honestly, it never felt like he took the reins at all. And I think I have some new insight into that situation around Martin Iles. And the other thing I've been talking about, this is all leading up to some new information. And the reason I'm mentioning this on This Week in Creationism and saying this is an important moment in the history of creationism that we are entering into. We're entering into, I think, a new phase of Young-Earth Creationism with respect to organizations. So another thing that to build the story up a little bit, we've been talking about the significant decline in attendance at the Ark Encounter. And I've shared some data that has been shared with me that is estimating the monthly attendance, and we'll see that red line there is 2025. You can disregard the green one, that's the COVID year. But that red lower line there shows a 15 to 30% decrease over what had been the high attendance marks. And really, over the last 3 years, it's been kind of a progressive decline, with this year showing much greater decline. By the way, I've seen the September numbers, and the September numbers are not quite as dramatic as the August and, well, especially May, June, and July numbers. But it is still lower. It's still lower than it was last year. And that's pretty remarkable considering the huge blitz of advertising that Answers in Genesis has put forward in the last couple of months. It's been quite a furious amount of promotion, and yet that has not yielded more visitors. And we've talked a little bit, and others have remarked in the comments about, it's the economy, stupid, right? Duh. It's like people don't have as many dollars to spend. And it's very expensive. They've raised the prices. And so that's a natural thing to look at. But whatever the reason is, the fact is there's fewer people visiting the Ark, and presumably fewer people visiting the Creation Museum, although we don't have any numbers for the Creation Museum, but I have to imagine they're not dissimilar from the Ark numbers. They probably track right with them. And so this has to be a concern, but I had said, based on the financials, that I didn't think that even this decline in the attendance was probably, terribly disconcerting, because of still the dollars being brought in and the number of donations, and their actual financial statements actually look pretty decent. But that was 2 years ago, and here we're seeing these declines now. So there's several bits of information that have come to my attention in just the last month that have made me look at things a little bit differently, and this is what I want to share with you today. And I want to be careful how I say this, because most of these are secondary sources, anonymous sources, various things that have gotten to me either directly or secondhand. And so, that's secondhand information. It's not, directly, it is hearsay information. The only reason I'm coming to you now to talk about it is because I've heard it from multiple different people that are clearly from different sources. So this isn't just one person out there, a lone wolf saying things that have been getting into the ears of people, and it's been, traveling around. This is multiple pieces of evidence that tell us that there is some really deep set issues at Answers in Genesis that are very, very concerning to those who work at Answers in Genesis, or in this case, no longer work at Answers in Genesis, because there's been pretty significant layoffs that have occurred not too long ago. One of the things that intrigued me, and I did this just a couple days ago, I had noticed that Harry F. Sanders was rather quiet on Answers in Genesis website, and he has become more vocal on his X account, where he has been rather subdued, having been an employee of Answers in Genesis. And so I noticed that he hadn't written anything, or nothing had been published on Answers in Genesis website. So I went to the AI chatbot at Answers in Genesis. Right. I've talked about how they have this little AI trained chatbot on their own material, so you can ask questions about Answers in Genesis. And what's intriguing about that chatbot is that it tends to reveal information that you really can't find just in the public files. Like if you just did a search, and then had to sort through different articles to try to find information, you wouldn't find this out. And here's an example. I was asking about Harry Sanders. All right. And I asked about what is his current situation, and it just referred to him in the past tense. And I thought that was kind of interesting. Why is it referring to him in the past tense? And then I searched for George Purd and others, and it talked about them in the present tense. So it got me thinking, maybe me noticing that I hadn't seen anything written by him meant that he's no longer there. And so I just asked, will Harry Sanders continue to write articles in the future on this site? And here was the AI chatbot's Answers in Genesis response. Harry F. Sanders III is no longer serving as a writer or researcher at Answers in Genesis. As a result, he is not expected to continue writing new articles. If you don't know who Harry F. Sanders is, I'll just say he's known for being the the author behind a large portion of a very controversial series of articles at Answers in Genesis called Young-Earth Evolution, in which they call out other Young-Earth creationists for being too evolutionary in their thinking. And so I can't say that I'm terribly surprised that if Answers in Genesis, as I've heard, have cut a large number of writers for their magazine and other areas, right, other support folks at Answers in Genesis, that he would be one of those individuals, given his, I'll just say it, his rather caustic personality. All right, so a number of writers are no longer there. We have 2 years ago, Martin Iles coming on board at the very same time that Bodhi Hodge went missing from Answers in Genesis and started his own ministry, a very small ministry of just himself. After essentially being the person who's running the day-to-day operation of Answers in Genesis, suddenly he's gone. And he's been completely scrubbed from the Answers in Genesis website. There's barely a mention of him other than a couple books which he's co-author on, but all of his articles are gone from Answers in Genesis website. And just a reminder, Bodhi Hodge is Ken Ham's son-in-law, and he left right around the same time that Martin Iles was entering into an arrangement to become the successor for Ken Ham. And I had chalked that up. This is one area where my speculation, I think, was wrong. So there's several areas where I have, read the tea leaves and made suggestions about what could be happening. And I just want to make sure I'm framing this as, most of what I'm going to say right now is still speculation, but based on more data. All right. And because Answers in Genesis doesn't say a lot, kind of leaves it out there for us to wonder what's going on. And so just having followed a lot of their stuff, I get a feel for things that are happening there. But I want to correct some things, or I'll say add some things to what I said before. But I want to parse this new information I have and think through it again. So that's what I'm going to do right now. So we have Bodhi Hodge leaving, Martin Iles coming in. We had a number of different other individuals leaving at that particular time, lesser folks at Answers in Genesis, but it was a noticeable turnover, probably a change of some roles. And then Ken Ham continued to write and blog and talk. Martin Iles did a couple series of videos, but it was very, from the outside, not apparent at all how he was integrating himself into the day-to-day operation of decision making, or whether his mark definitely had not been made in terms of who he was going to be and what was his focus, how was going to take Answers in Genesis forward and continue the legacy of Ken Ham. That was not clear at all. And what became clear to me, and I mentioned this at the time, you can go back and look at previous episodes, it just never felt right, never felt like he was fully engaged. And I kind of wondered, is what's going on here? And then suddenly he's gone, right? It just he's departed to do his own. He felt called, right? That's the lingo we use when we don't want to say exactly what happened. We say that person felt called, to another ministry, of which he's doing now. And I've been following Martin Iles, and he has a number of irons in the fire to start new ministries. And he has said nothing about Answers in Genesis. All right. It's one of those, I'll say nothing bad. I leave. I probably get a certain amount of my salary. It's like a football coach, right? Going to get paid for the next 2 years and walk away. And so my rationale for why he left originally was that it's simply, what happens in a lot of organizations. You come in, you find out it's probably not exactly what you thought it was. You find out that that the ministry is just it's going in a certain direction, and you don't feel like maybe you can make the kind of contribution you thought you were going to make, or maybe there's personality clashes with individuals there, and you're not really given complete authority, because it seemed like Ken Ham wasn't really going to completely let go. This is just what happens when you have a pastor that's been in a church for 30 or 40 years, right? Or even 15 years. right? They become well established, and then you have like, oh, they're going to retire, or they're going to step down, or but they're still going to be in the area. Maybe they're coming to that church still. It's very hard for the next person to come in and like be a little bit different. I've experienced that myself in a church that had a longtime pastor. New pastor comes in. I was on the search committee and helped hire that new pastor. And, it wasn't like his changes were dramatic, but there's always individuals that are like, well, this is the way we've always done it. And, we need to keep the legacy of that person before us. It's just very hard to change. And so I just kind of chalked it up to, it's like, it just isn't a good fit. And, that happens, and so I didn't see anything terribly nefarious in it. However, I've heard through, again, as I said before, I've heard this from three different people contacting me, either friends who know people that are close to AIG, or in one case, an individual who is very close to AIG reached out to me anonymously and gave me some lowdown on what's happening there. Now, all of these, just want to remind you, all this is, I can't confirm these things, and I'm not going to go into any detail. I'm just going to say that the financial situation is a whole lot worse than I thought, especially since now they've heard that they've laid off a significant number of people at Answers in Genesis over the last couple of months. And it's specifically because of financial difficulties. And now it kind of like clicks into place. They have been, you sound like everything's good when you like constantly, Ken Ham is showing like every other day, like the new construction, all right? We've got a greenhouse going up. We've got this new Jerusalem site. We've got this new whole big entrance to Answers to the Ark Encounter. And so there's with a bunch of displays in there, the Creation Museum is adding on a segment, and they're adding on a restaurant. And all right, so it's like a mega building projects all over there. We're talking millions and millions of dollars. And that gives the impression of, hey, we've got plenty of money, and we want to make this better, and grow this thing. It's like, it's like companies that are just like constantly like, we got to show growth for our stockholders, keep them interested, keep the products rolling out. And so they're constantly have a new product, a new reason to come back, because they're in the theme attraction, theme park world. Yes, they have all kinds of other ministries, but where the bread and butter is actually bringing people to their sites and paying the big bucks. And that requires having something to gaze at, something new, some new piece of eye candy. And apparently it's not bringing in enough. And we've seen and as I said, I kind of dismissed the reduced number of visitors as this is kind of a drop in the bucket. They still have lots of money. Don't think they're just going to go belly up, anytime soon. They're fine. And also I've always believed and have heard, they have some significant contributors. It's not all about the small dollar amounts from lots and lots of people, which they get an amazing amount of contributions from small donors, but they also have some deep pockets out there. Now, the thing is, when you have deep pockets donations, if one of those doesn't come through, if there is a perception of an issue of like how money is being spent, right? What the future is of this corporation, then those dollars might not come in anymore. Right. And that's when you can really take a hit. Now, I haven't heard anything about that particular source drying up, but clearly they don't feel like they're in a financially stable situation right now. And that's going to require some significant change. And so that then leads me to realize that what really has happened here, or this would be my best guess now about Martin Iles. Martin Iles came in, as I'm seeing this time of volatility now. He comes in and he sees, this place isn't as well off as I thought it was. And we have an aged, leader who's can't really let up the reins as much as he talks about needing to and wanting to. And we've got some serious Well, let's just say, again, I don't want to go into too many details here. Uh, let's just say improprieties, both financial and moral issues that are issues of accountability and so forth, within the organization. This goes beyond the recent scandal about one of their bands that plays there, in which one of the leaders was, is in jail right now for. I mean, go look it up. I don't really want to go through that whole thing again. You can look at my past issues, This Week in Creationism. I'll talk about it a little bit. But let's just say that there are people that aren't there anymore, that are, not there for a reason, and that there's a lot of turmoil. There's just a lot of friction inside Answers in Genesis. And again, I've heard that from multiple sources. And so it's only because I've now heard it from many different places. And it's only because I've heard it from multiple different places that I think that it's worth actually talking about and considering the ramifications of that. And one of the big ramifications is it's going to be harder to replace Ken Ham. All right. If Martin Iles comes in and maybe all these other scandals that are behind the scenes he becomes aware of that he wasn't aware of when he was hired, you can imagine somebody like, I put myself out here to become this leader of a large organization and be the next leader for the next decade. But I don't even really have the authority to necessarily clean up this mess. And a lot of this mess has to do with the leadership that's there that I can't get rid of. Okay. So, so that means I can't really have the kind of effect that I need to have. And therefore, I'd best just get out. It's starting to make a lot more sense of why he left not too long after coming and not really becoming engaged in the place. That's always been a bit of a mystery. And it feels much less mysterious to me now. Without going into details, I feel a lot more confident that Martin Iles probably made a wise decision in not sticking around. Okay, I've been flapping my lips for quite a while on this. There's a couple of other important things to consider, and that is the future of Answers in Genesis. They need a charismatic spokesperson. All right. You've got a large infrastructure to uphold. You have to continue to bring in, close to 1 million people a year into your attractions in order to maintain the status quo. In order to have the type of influence in terms of drawing in donation dollars, again, you have to have a charismatic face, somebody who is, I don't want to use the word respected, but well known, we'll just say. And they're not going to find that within. There is nobody within Answers in Genesis right now. Save, I hate to even say the word, Calvin Smith, who's CEO of Answers in Genesis in Canada. He's got the swagger and the. I'm sure he would love to do that. He would be a disaster for Answers in Genesis. I think they probably know that. Maybe I shouldn't tell him. maybe we shouldn't tell him. Calvin would be horrible. But nonetheless, they have to track somebody from the outside. And if they have this much turmoil and they have this many issues inside this, and the issues are multifaceted, and it's not one thing, and it's not going to be a quick fix. That is a significant problem. And Ken Ham's going to have a really tough time finding a successor. And it makes a lot of sense now to me why he's been bemoaning the fact that, many of the leaders around him are gone. He doesn't have that support net of people to help continue to raise dollars for him, and, the back and forth that entails. And he doesn't see where the future of his organization is going to be when his son-in-law is an outcast, right from the family. So it's a pretty tough spot that Answers in Genesis is in right now. And I'm frankly, I'm a little bit surprised. I really, people ask all the time, well, when's Answers in Genesis basically going to collapse in on itself? Yes, they split a long time ago. And part of it was because of institutional reliance on Ken Ham and feeling like he was kind of a dictator and They saw that this would be a problem someday, and yep, it's a problem. At some point, that maybe he's had too much control and too much influence on how the money was spent, and it's not been spent well and not been spent wisely. I'm not talking about fraud. I'm not talking about. I mean, let's just say I don't know about any fraud, but honestly, it's just it's over exuberance. It's feeling like God's going to bless whatever you do, so you just keep moving forward, and so it's not being fiscally, conservative and faithful with your money. So those aren't crimes; they're just not wise decisions. And Ken Ham not making a wise decision is not exactly a shocker, given his inability to think methodically through the evidence of scripture and of science and to come to sound conclusions. So we'll just leave it at that. Okay, on to the next topic. We need to. It is about answers, a member of Answers in Genesis, but we're not going to be going on and on about this topic. Let's let it sit for a month and see how things shake out and talk about it again. Okay, so just earlier today, this video was published on YouTube by Nathaniel Jeanson at Answers in Genesis. The real reason why 99% of scientists reject biblical creation. And I watched this short 5-minute video, and it's the same old stuff. It's the overconfidence. It's the, like, I'm bringing data and I have proof and evidence, and this is going to shock you. In this case, it's going to stun you. Yeah, I was stunned by the stupidity of this particular video. But I wasn't surprised by it. So I wasn't shocked by it and by any means that this video would be produced and by anything that he said. Now, I was a little shocked that his very first image in his video is of Kent Hovind. And I'm like, if you're trying to make a serious point and you're going to start out a video showing a picture of Kent Hovind, I don't know who the video processor was that thought this was a good idea to put Kent Hovind behind Nathaniel Jeanson's voice. Because if you want to be taken seriously, having Kent Hovind start you out is just not the way to go. So I want to play just a very short snippet of this to give you a sense for how Nathaniel Jeanson approaches the topic. And then we're going to critique most of everything he said in this short video. So remember, the reason why 99% of scientists reject biblical creation is what he's addressing. He's going to present very powerful evidence for why the vast majority of Americans reject Young-Earth Creationism. It basically boils down to, hey, if you've been taught something, that's what you'll believe. And since 99% of the population has been taught evolution, that's what they believe. And only 1% of the population has been taught Young-Earth Creationism, and that's what they believe. That's it. That's the claim. The other, I call it punchline from the video, is this. He claims that 99% of all PhDs accept evolution because, well, why? Because that's what they've been taught. It's that simple, right? I mean, what could be more difficult? That's why he only needs a 5-minute video, because it's like, duh, hey, if whatever you've been taught, that's what you're going to believe. And so implicit in this is, if we could just teach more people about Young-Earth Creationism, there'd be more Young-Earth Creationists. It's a nice, tidy little story. And if you read the comment section below this, there's hundreds and hundreds of comments that suggest that that is a very powerful message that is completely and utterly convincing to his audience. But what's it really doing? It's just explaining away the overwhelming scientific consensus by reducing it to just classroom conditioning. Professors that are just manipulating their students and bowling them over and forcing them to believe things. It's not really any different than, what an old saying, monkey see, monkey do. And this video even touches upon a courtroom sort of subplot in which the courts have supposedly kept creation science out of schools, right? That's why 99% of the population believes in evolution, is because that's all they're taught and they're told that's what they have to believe. And that's because the courts have basically mandated that evolution be taught and creationism not be taught. This according to Nathaniel Jeanson. And why does Nathaniel Jeanson believe that that's the case? Because he says, well, that's because the courts and those PhD scientists, they know that evolution can't tolerate any competition at all, and therefore they have to eliminate that competition. Because if the story of young earth creationism were heard, obviously there'd be many, many, many more young earth creationists. Well, look, like as a Christian myself, who gladly confesses the authority of Scripture and also works as a biologist, I got to say, this is just not a serious explanation. It's a rhetorical shortcut that misreads the data. It misstates legal history. It's just loading a theological conclusion into a sociological hunch. That's what Jeanson has here. He has a sociological hunch going on that he claims is powerful evidence. I think we can do better. I think in service of the truth and in service of the church, all right, I think Answers in Genesis needs to do better than this type of video that they're putting out. Let's give a little short listen here to just a minute or so of Nathaniel Jeanson explaining his methodology, all right?
Wanted to know enrollment in creation-friendly universities versus enrollment in evolution-only universities.
So he's going to compare two university types.
Friendly universities, Answers in Genesis has published a list. It's not long.
I love that. Answers in Genesis has published a list of creation-friendly universities. Yes, they do. They have like the officially approved universities and colleges you can go to and send your children to that will teach them young earth creationism. And as he kind of parenthetically tosses in there, it's not long, right? It's because it's a really short list of truly young earth creationist institutions. And you know what? That list has gotten shorter. Right. That list used to be longer and it has shrunk over time. Now, their criteria have also become more rigid over time as well. But I truly think that it has shrunk, which I can't help but say, if you're measuring success and your measure of success is, acceptance of young earth creation, and your whole goal is to get it into education and teach the young and to get it into the milieu of the American culture. All right. The fact that you've gone from more Christian professors in colleges and theologians teaching young earth creationism to fewer over time doesn't suggest you're being successful. All right. Yes, your organization grew and it's worth millions of dollars more than it was before. And you can say you're reaching more people. But this measure of success in terms of college grads and colleges and other professionals accepting your interpretation doesn't bode well, all right, for the future of young earth creationism. But let's continue.
I took the Answers in Genesis list and then added a few more schools where students might hear something other than
They might hear something other than just the evolutionary story. In other words, some schools try. There's a few people there that might tell the young earth creationist story, but unfortunately they mix it with also telling the other story as well.
Evolution. It still wasn't a long list. Then I searched the national...
And that still wasn't a long list, right? Really, there really aren't that many institutions, even Christian colleges that, especially in the biology department, would spend a lot of time talking about young earth creationism. They might have a worldview class in which they do comparison and contrast, but you're going to learn about evolutionary theory at most Christian colleges.
National Center for Education Statistics for numbers for each of these schools. Then I used the same database to get total nationwide enrollment figures. The result? The total number of undergraduates who are exposed to something other than evolution is only around 1%. 99% of college undergraduates are taught only evolution.
99% are only taught evolution. No mention of young earth creationism. Okay, so now there's your 99%.
99% of PhDs hold to evolution.
Whoa, look at that. Let's see, surveys suggest that 99% of PhDs. And so, wow, and look at that, 99% of students only hear an evolutionary story. Isn't that an amazing coincidence? 99% and 99%.
Perfect match. In scientific or statistical terms.
A perfect match? Now that is not a very scientific thing to say, is it? I doubt it was a perfect match. If you got actual numbers, it's not exactly 99%. It's 99.2. Or, I mean, he has actual numbers of students, right? Out of total number of students. And so he has an actual percent. If it was a perfect match, I know I'm being nitpicky just for the fun of it here. If If it was the perfect match, it'd have to be exactly the same percent. Highly doubtful it was the same percent. I mean, he should be probably a little more specific about that.
Enrollment perfectly predicts the views of PhDs.
See, it's a perfect alignment, 99% of students and 99% of PhDs. And that's a perfect match to the students.
On evolution. In other words, 99% of PhDs are evolutionists because this is all they're ever taught. Do you find yourself bristling at my conclusion?
I am furrowing my brow a little bit at that conclusion. There's this direct one-to-one relationship. 99% of students only heard evolution, and then 99% of the eventual PhDs that come from, apparently only come from those students, are also evolutionists. Okay, I can't play the whole thing, but I am going to comment on a good portion of what he has said here. And so here's my response. All right. Number one. All right. Let's talk about the science first. Correlation isn't causation. Right? I mean, how many times do we have to say that? Right? I don't think the numbers say exactly what he thinks they're saying. And he's so excited about this result, as if it's like astounding and amazing, and like no one has ever identified this problem before. Maybe 97 to 99% of scientists accept evolution. Reports just a result, right? That's a result of a survey. It's not a mechanism. It's not a like, what path did they take in order to reach their conclusions? To claim this is because that's what they were taught, right? That's going to confuse correlation with causation. You're saying what the cause was, right? But it's simply a correlation with their beliefs. PhD scientists aren't just some kind of like sample of undergraduate students that just got done, hearing about Bio 101 in their very first, experience with maybe evolutionary biology, right? They're trained to test claims against evidence, and they've been doing that for years, right? Often for many decades. And they've earned a PhD. And during that PhD, graduate research isn't some sort of like catechism where, you're learning the thou shalts. All right. Yes, you're learning processes. You're learning how to think as a scientist. But part of that is discovering new things and questioning what's already known and applying the scientific method to test those ideas. Sure, I bet that there are those that are going to uncritically accept something. Right. But to think that 99% of scientists are unable to critically examine evolutionary theory, I think that's completely preposterous. What about this 1% creation-friendly enrollment? It's just a definition game. Again, it's not a true discovery he's made here. If you define creation-friendly, like when he says creation-friendly universities and colleges, to mean explicitly young Earth, of course you're going to find that list is really tiny. Right? There's only a few colleges, and that's not going to be many students. But that says more about how you're categorizing your data rather than the exposure to alternatives, right? There are many Christian universities. They're getting exposure to a wide range of views, Young-Earth Creationist among them, right? They have courses on science and faith. They're probably philosophy and science, probably in religion courses. They're going to discuss these kind of differences. Why? Because there's a rich history throughout the 2,000 years of Christian thought in which people have struggled and with this particular topic of the interpretation of Genesis 1. And it talked about how to understand the world around us. And you're going to run into those different opinions, and they're not all just straight up Young-Earth creationists. Also, students are encountering creationist arguments through churches, campus ministries, YouTube, ministries like Answers in Genesis, right? And they may have been homeschooled, right? So they've been involved in literature all the way up through high school. And then maybe they go to college and they don't go to a Christian college that's on the approved list by Answers in Genesis, and they hear about evolutionary biology. Maybe that's all they hear, but it's not like that's all they've ever heard in their life. So this only evolution is ever taught, as if that's all they've ever heard, right? 99% of the population, all they've ever heard is evolutionary biology. And therefore, that's why 99% of the PhDs that we churn out are evolutionary biologists. That just isn't true of the students' actual information like ecosystem that they've been brought up in. All right, number 3. PhDs are earned by producing new knowledge, asking new questions, asking questions of old data in new ways. And it has to survive the peer review process, like an examination of what you've done. If evolution were just some sort of classroom slogan that we rah around, it would just eventually collapse under the weight of experiments, right? There's genomic data sets, there's predictive models, right? It hasn't. Also, look, a large share of PhDs working in the United States, they weren't trained in the United States. They were trained somewhere else, right? In other countries where they probably don't teach evolutionary biology. I've known a whole bunch of graduate students that come from other countries, and many of them are really clueless about evolutionary theory, right? So it's not like that's been, entrained in them since the earlier grades. And so they might only be experiencing it now in graduate school. So the NCES data set for U.S. undergraduate enrollment certainly doesn't perfectly predict their views, right? Since they weren't taught here in the United States. So this video's perfect match, which he says, is a shocking match, 99% of students and 99% of PhDs. It's just a storytelling device, all right? Something to make the video sound sexy and attractive and catch lots of views. Right? It is not a statistically viable result. Right? You know what? If education were really that powerful, right? If schooling really were destiny, then students who grew up hearing only Young-Earth Creationist claims in church would remain Young-Earth Creationist in college. But many don't. I would say most don't. They change their minds after engaging radiometric dates that are cross-checked. They see phylogenies that can predict things. They look at fossils that appear in ordered sequences, consistent across continents, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. This isn't because professors browbeat them. It's because the data is coherent, all right? It fits together. It makes sense of students' observations of the world that they've made in their travels and things that they've heard and seen. Now, maybe this is the place to point out that Jeanson was taught at a secular university, all right, secular college, and then a secular PhD program. All right, and so he would be part of the 99%, right, by his calculation, right? 99% are taught evolutionary theory, and therefore they become evolutionary PhDs. But wait a second. He's a PhD, but he's not an evolutionary, doesn't accept evolution. So therefore, he doesn't fit the category that he's created of they only know what they've been taught, right? He's in the 1% in terms of belief in Young-Earth Creationism. So it's not a one-to-one correlation. Well, then he goes on and he tries to bring in a court case. He tries to bring in a legal argument to help bolster his case for why so many people don't accept Young-Earth Creationism. And he cites McLean versus Arkansas, 1982, one of the favorites for Young-Earth Creationists to talk about, and also Edwards versus Aguillard in 1987. And he acts as if the courts kept, creation science out. And why would that be, according to Nathaniel Jeanson? Well, it's because the courts wanted to protect evolution from scrutiny because apparently it couldn't handle scrutiny. I think that's a complete misread. And everybody I've read who's talked about that case and has looked in it legally, those rulings are based on an establishment clause, right? It's not on scientific turf protection. The judges there, they concluded that creation science advanced a specific religious doctrine under the banner of science, and thus could not be mandated in public school science classes. It's really important to notice what the decisions of these judges didn't do, right? They didn't forbid critiques of evolution. Free to critique evolution. We should critique evolution. They didn't ban discussing the history and philosophy of science, and they didn't pronounce evolution beyond question. They ruled on which kinds of claims belong in publicly founded science curriculum and why. I mean, you can disagree with that reason. You can disagree with those judges, but you have to at least cite the right reason that they were using to remove creation science from the classroom. So what he's doing here is he's doing what he often does, which is create a false dichotomy. This setup implies that if you reject Young-Earth Creationism, you must either be anti-Bible or you got to be part of some kind of conspiracy. Okay, look, there's a third way, and it's a really old way. It's existed for a long time, and that is many faithful Christians who have read Scripture as Scripture, struggled to understand exactly what the authors were intending to teach us in those Scriptures, also studying nature as God's word, maybe struggling to understand exactly how it is that God has operates this particular world, and have tried to understand both faithfully. Now, there's a second fallacy embedded in this video here called motivated inference. You see, he uses this line, "They believe it because they were taught it." And when he does so, he's using it, he's asserting it when explaining that what scientists are doing and how they come to their conclusions. But he denies it when explaining creationist. So why not ask whether both groups are also engaging evidence with prior commitments? Is that the only reason that Nathaniel Jeanson believes in a Young-Earth Creationism, is because he was taught it, right? Did they only believe it because he was taught it? And certainly he would deny that, and I don't actually think that that is how he came to believe it necessarily. And so, but he needs to also allow for scientists to come to their convictions, not just because they were taught it as well. I think he has a category error too. He's like treating this, what evolutionary theory is, just like this really expansive, evidence-rich theory, right, as like a single position, right? It's just this word evolution. And somehow that's competing with creation, which is very much I'll say a theological confession. Of course, they're applying it to the physical creation of the world as well, but it is mostly a theological position. And so that confuses sort of levels of explanation and purposes behind the theories or the ideas, the concepts. See, evolution explains the patterns in biology. It's an attempt, it's a theory, right? It's an explanatory framework that attempts to bring together all the evidence we make from observations of the world into a coherent explanation for the things that we see. Whereas creation confesses the world's authorship and its purpose in this world, and there's really none of that in the whole idea of evolutionary theory. So there aren't really rival species in that sense, in terms of like theory to theory. And so it's like not a fair comparison unless you're really going to get in and talk about specific portions of evolutionary theory, specific portions of creation theory. So now let me just speak as I'll say a Reformed Christian. The Young-Earth Creationist move is to equate a 24-hour day chronology, a global flood covering all the mountains, as the only possible faithful reading of Genesis, the only true reading of Genesis. Honestly, this claim is just so incredibly historically narrow. Right from Augustine to Calvin, the church has recognized both the clarity of God's authorship and the complexity of how God's works are described to us, right, as fallible created beings. Calvin's doctrine of accommodation reminds us the Scripture speaks truly to the first hearers in their world, right, to its original audience. For a couple thousand years, I think we could sum up what theologians, pastors, and Christians have drawn from Genesis as a universal truth, is that Genesis tells Israel who made the world, right? God tells him what kind of world it is. What are the operating principles? And I don't mean the physical operating principles of the world in that. And it also, most importantly, probably tells us who we are to God, right? Before God. And it does all that without requiring us to turn the text into a modern geological manual. Now, one might argue that it is a geological manual as well. And that's what Young-Earth Creationists are doing. They're saying it's all those things that we all agree upon, but it's also a manual of exactly the how-to book on how God actually made this world in a physical sense. Other Christians have disagreed for a long time about just how much God is trying to reveal to us about his actual mechanisms of creation. So when Young-Earth Creationist voices insist that the chronology and flood hydraulics are the only possible faithful option, they turn one modern, I'm going to call it a very modern American 20th century tradition into a test of orthodoxy. Let's face it, that's not fidelity to Scripture. That's just narrowing the Catholic breadth of the church's hermeneutics and history of thought. So what's the core problem here? And I'll say with Nathaniel Jeanson's video, but in a broader context, Answers in Genesis. I mean, the argument he's trying to make here, he's trying to explain away the consensus scientific view with sociology rather than meeting the evidence with science. Right? It sets up courts as villains, right? Guarding some sort of fragile theory when the record shows that it was constitutional concerns. He kind of presents it as a funnel. You put all this teaching into a student, and then out of the bottom, you're just producing evolutionists. Right? But that erases the whole idea of critical thought, of adversarial thinking, of coming to one's own conclusions, of testing ideas. I also think it narrows the church's interpretive heritage, as I said before, to just a single modern reading. And it calls into question all other Orthodox Christians as compromisers. And so, if you've heard me talk before, you know that I don't think you have to choose between this fidelity of Scripture and honesty about God's world. You can reject overstated Young-Earth claims, which is what I'm doing here all the time, right, without actually rejecting the gospel. We can hold fast to Christ. We can read Genesis as the church has long read it, right? First for who God is, who we are, right? And we can engage with science with curiosity. The truth is truly unified in God, then the real hard work of reconciling our understanding is an act of discipleship, not of defeat. And to my Young-Earth Creationist friends out there, I'm not questioning your faith. I'm just challenging an argument that takes a shortcut around the evidence and the church's hermeneutical breadth. Look, if creationists, they care about the truth, they don't need these gotcha explanations for why scientists disagree with them. They need better arguments. And they need some humility to revise them. And they need some humility to revise them when the data and the word rightly read demand it. Well, I think that's all I've got to say. I know I'm being a little extra preachy in This Week in Creationism. Typically, it's just like a review of what's happening in the world of creationism. But this video kind of got to me in terms of just its over-the-top preachiness. All right. So therefore, I guess I had to be a little preachy in response. All right, that's it for This Week in Creationism. I'm afraid if I say anything more, I will regret what I've said. So I'm just gonna leave it there. We'll see what happens in the next couple months and with Answers in Genesis. Thanks for listening. We'll talk to you later. Bye-bye.